Welcome. Welcome to all of you on the internet who are watching with us here and will watch in the times to come. This is Ian McKenzie, and co-steward and co-founder of the Pandemic is a Prism series. I'm joined by my good brother, Zamir.
Hi, everyone.
And we are here to unpack, as we do, this sort of addition to the official interviews is that we unpack and reflect upon the conversations as they happened. In this case, we'll be unpacking the conversation with author and poet SOPHIE STRAND, which we conducted last week. And just reflecting, riffing on some of the things that stood out for us as we sort of transparently wonder, again, what stirred in us around this conversation. And I would love for Zamir to kick us off on our conversation today.
Well, yeah, we're coming off the coattails of Samhain, or also known as Halloween. And what an interesting time. Part of what I wanted to bring up in our recap was this idea of narratives where human beings aren't at the center. And Halloween's such an interesting time. I think one of the reasons everybody loves it is because it's a time where we don't have to be ourselves. We get to put on a different mask. There's this plethora of archetypes and beings that are swimming around us that are just waiting to be given expression. And this is an eve where we all get to become into this whole new ecosystem of different characters and different beings, some embodied, some disembodied. What an exciting time. And I think that's something that human beings really love to do, is the relief of not being at the center of everything. And I think that was something that came up with our conversation with Sophie. She has this line that human narratives don't dominate the ecosystem, and that deep time is working on scales that we don't comprehend. And she furthered that on with this really interesting line that ties it, I think, to the pandemic. She says, "This tide of viral negotiation may have very little to do with us, and we may not be the main character. We're participating in an ecosystem of stories, but we're not the main character." Mm-hmm. And so, Ian, I wanted to get your thoughts on this because, when we first started this in our description of the event, one of the lines that really stood out to me was, and exploring narratives where human beings aren't at the center. And I've seen that to be a kind of a common theme of many of the people that have been invited, where they've entertained, how does the world look when it's not with us at the center? And I know it's something you contemplated a lot. Wanted to hear your thoughts on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. Good way to dive in. I'm struck by something that has stood with me, and I've continued to really wonder about, is how within a human-centric orientation, that there's only certain narratives that we see, and in some ways, Western civilization seems rife with the sort of classic narrative constructs, right? This is something I was taught in English class, I believe. But this idea that, there's only really, 3 or 4 types of narratives. It's like man against nature, right? Man against man, I believe, and man against himself, right? There's something along those lines. And like, that was it. That was the whole possible spectrum, right, of narratives. And of course now, especially within this context, you're like, whoa, wait a second, what? That's the only narratives, which are all involving oneself, or like a human-centric construct. And there was something that Stephen Jenkinson had said, not in the conversation, I don't believe in the conversation we had prior in this series, but something he'd said in a teaching. But he said, the wild doesn't mean you harm. It just doesn't mean you. Oof, right? That's pretty good. And the similar sentiment there, which is that once freed from the narrow confines of the human-centric, strivings and triumphs and all the rest, then one begins to invite in the possibility that, again, that life has the much bigger narratives unfolding, and that I think it's a bit of a conceit from the egocentric lens that humans tend to occupy. And I won't say all humans, of course, because I think achieved culture, particularly a kind of indigenous understanding, I think, is that this sort of human-centric lens is constantly interrupted, right? Because it is actually, it's easy in a sense to forget that there's other narratives at play, that we're sort of part of a much bigger story. It's easy in the sense that because of the very construct that humans have, like the egoic sense of one's own self is the most concerning all the time, right? Like I think of in terms of my son, right? He's 3, and he's very much in that right now. Like, you know, he's the center of the universe, absolutely. And how appropriate that is at that age, right? How appropriate at that age. And at a certain point, this is, I think, where rites of passage come into play from a deep understanding, is that human-centric idea that one is the center of everything needs to be compassionately and yet firmly interrupted and dissolved and composted to allow for a sort of reorganization into a much bigger story. And so I think Sophie, when she speaks about that in this deep time narratives, and that in this case with the virus even, that, you know, the human realm is consequential to us, obviously, to humans, but as far as the much bigger story out there, again, it's good to wonder about, you know, how big a part or not are we playing.
Yeah, I feel maybe that's a mark of some of the intellectual maturity that, you know, I've seen from many of the speakers that have come. I imagine that a big part of that has been a product of the ability to, you know, take themselves out of the center of this narrative. And all of a sudden, when you do that, you see everybody else's story, you know, and how all these other things are interconnected. And really, it's more about your place within something and fulfilling your place within an Indian context. You know, we call that one's dharma or swadharma, right? One's own duty or role within the larger scheme of life. And everybody has something called a svabhav, which is your own disposition. And sort of your disposition is connected to your role, actually. And that's something beautiful, right? And I feel that, like you use this word, achieved cultures, that they all tend to have this understanding that, you know, everybody has a role and a place. But if you take yourself too seriously, which I think is part of the challenge, is you take yourself too seriously, then you almost, it's kind of like a spider web or something, right? Like if you warp the whole web, you know, kind of off. And I think that's part of what I think Sophie is, and many others, but I really feel her lamenting is like, hey guys, why we're doing this again and again and again and again, and there's real consequences, and we have to wake up to that.
Well, this is interesting too, right? Because we did spend a bit of time on this word awake, I believe, right? What does it mean to be awake? And I shared a bit of, again, an understanding that had come of this sense of to awaken to one's consequence is the kind of awakeness that is being asked now. And I think Sophie had a beautiful articulation that one's own suffering can be a window into the suffering of the world. And in fact, a different conversation that we'd held earlier, this is for my podcast as well, we spoke about masculinity and mythology, kind of going in that lens. But she spoke about this idea of wedding one's wounds to the wounds of the world, right? That those places that are wounded within one's own direct ecosystem that one resides in and can build relationship to, that perhaps that's an opportunity to show up, right? And there was this I thought it was pretty powerful sort of breaking a spell in the moment of when I think you were asking her, right, some question around, I guess, these bigger or smaller human narratives, and she really invited this sense of, yeah, but this is what is right outside my window, right? Like here's where the ecosystem needs me to show up right outside my window. And she put it to you as well with the same question, and you know, you were like, oh, okay, that's neat. And then you kind of went to the next question, and she was like, whoa, wait a second. No, I'm actually asking you right now. Yeah. But I'd love to hear you speak about that moment as well.
Well, before I do, and this not evading it, I will speak to it. But you know what you spoke of our pain, allowing us to feel the pain or the suffering of the world, or as a gateway to that. That's sort of what I was alluding to when I spoke of the heroine's journey. Because we had kind of an interesting repartee around Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey and the heroine's journey. We really didn't get to go into it, I felt, enough. And, you know, Joseph Campbell, he said this line that the heroine's journey begins where the hero's journey ends. And where does the hero's journey end? It ends with the finding of the Grail, which is for him a symbol of discovering compassion, which is thinking about others, which is having empathy, which is one's own suffering become a gateway to participating in ennobling way the suffering of the world. And that this idea of, I was talking about what's the name of that story? Wizard of Oz. Yeah. And how Jean Houston uses that. And one of the things that Dorothy does is she connects with the Tin Man. She connects with the lion. She connects with the straw man and sort of sees their suffering and sees their foibles. And she actually, through relating to them and empowering and encouraging them, is able to take them along on this journey with us. That their stories are very important to her. And that, hey, we're all kind of in this together. And, you know, I can understand why there's this hesitancy to want to fall into stereotypes of like hero and heroine, like masculine and feminine. But there is, I think, a benefit to having this kind of recognition that there is a polarity and that there is this definite shift that's going on in that sort of meta narrative of the collective consciousness, which is we need to start shifting out of this more heroic, patriarchal based into one that is fundamentally more relational and rooted in empathy, because that's the only way where we can really listen to all the other stories that are at play. Because the sad reality of human beings is that we're really interested in ourselves. Like we only care about something when it affects us. That's how the world is playing out today. So how are we going to evoke this response of stepping outside of ourselves when it has to happen before we sort of hit the wall? She calls rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, right? So I don't know if you want to sort of share your thoughts on that before I go to the first question you asked me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always alert, I think, to certain spell casting, right? And this sense that anytime there's talk of humans in general, right? I think it's a very broad stroke. I mean, I'm sure I've done it even a few times already in this conversation, but the sense that, you know, all humans are this way, or even all humans tend to care about themselves. I mean, in some ways, yes, but it's also those qualities can be reinforced or reconditioned depending on the cultural system that one's in, right? So in that sense, you know, I think I either read somewhere, heard that, you know, we don't get post-traumatic stress disorder from helping people, right? Like it's something to consider there, that by hurting people, we are hurt ourselves, and it shows up as trauma or PTSD, right? And again, that the reverse isn't true. So for me, that seems to say that the architecture of the human is actually built towards supporting and empathy as our disposition, and that if certain conditions are there or certain traumas, of course, are enacted, then that sort of base level desire to help or desire to be connected, right, is interrupted or distorted. And so I don't know. I just feel like it's helpful to maybe remind ourselves of that, remind me of that, because otherwise I can get into a bit of misanthropy, right? Of like, oh, humans, you know, what are you going to do? So that's there for me. And I think just the other point on the hero heroine's journey too. I mean, it's interesting if the heroine's journey includes the non-human, right? That so I think the focus on the hero's journey as a human-centric narrative only is part of that, you know, cutting out of the rest of the world. And there was the story that Steve spoke about of Beowulf, right? What does hospitality mean really to the rest of the world, and what is the consequence when we don't make a seat at the table for the rest, the other participants in the story?
Well,
right?
if you think of Dorothy, I mean, Tin Man is of the mineral kingdom, Straw Man is of the plant kingdom, the lion is of the animal kingdom. I mean, the kingdoms are represented there in their own way. I mean, anthropomorphized, yes, because it's a story, but interesting to think about it that way.
Yeah, I love that reading, actually. That adds a new flavor for sure. So I'd love to hear, you too, as well, when Sophie invited you to really tune in to, you know, the ecosystem that was very true and present for you at that moment.
Yeah, well, I think when she asked me, I had this moment of being like, is she really asking me that question, or was it kind of rhetorical? And then I brushed it off a little bit and just went on to the next points. One of my pattern, something I'm apt to do, actually, trying to be more aware of it. But when she became more pointed, being like, hey, actually, no, I'm asking you this question. I want to know, like, where are you? What's happening outside of your window, right? Like, where are you situated? Because that for me is more real. And I think part of what evoked that from her and in the conversation was that it was becoming more intellectual, more abstract. And the whole purpose of it is to actually ground us more and more into this somatic reality, into our reality and our relationship with the world around us that's living and breathing, not just with concepts and ideas. And there was this urge to be like, okay, but this is what it's really about here. We could have this whole conversation, but I want to know, where are you? And so that kind of stunned me back into a pause. And then I did share with her some of the magic of where I've been living for the last year, and some of the ways in which my relationship and dialogue with the natural world had affirmed to me the place that I was in and my interconnectedness with it, that there was a living dialogue, and knowing that I was leaving that place. The prayer that came forth was one that was in communication with all the life that had been holding me in that place, that I was actually witnessed. I was witnessed by trees, and I was witnessed by birds, and I was witnessed by the mountain I was in. And it's such a feeling, a wonderful feeling, as we started the beginning of the conversation, where I wasn't at the center of it. And so I get to say, oh, I'm one amongst all of this life, and I give thanks for my role in being here and my participation in witnessing in all of this. And I think that that's something that we all want all human beings to experience once we've experienced it ourselves. And it's the ancient story of, when the joy of not being caught up in your own little world.
Mm-hmm. This, makes me think of, I believe I brought it up with Charles in our conversation, but this parallel between the words immune and commune, right? And, again, it's funny, or it's interesting to parallel that, of course, with the vax conversation, but this idea of to be immune is to be sort of outside of the choreography of life, and to commune, right, seems to be to participate in some way. And Sophie, and I asked her this, right, on this question around purity, because she had written a number of pieces, I believe, sort of circling this reorientation to this idea of purity. And in some ways, again, it sort of challenged, I think, both the maybe the mainstream pro-vax conversation as well as the anti-vax conversation, right, which can really circle around this idea of purity and maintaining purity against getting a vaccine. But she had just a really interesting take, right, which if I recall, and I'm happy to hear what stood out for you as well, but a sense of that one is a sort of choreographed symphony of so many beings, like one's own body, and that we're sort of participating, generally unawares, it seems, in so much of this, exchange. And you could call it, toxic isn't maybe quite the right word, but it's like, it's hard to be able to draw a line to say, okay, like, within this sphere, it's like, I'm pure. And in this, it's because I'm not going to participate at all with these. And yet we're this phenomena, right, that is happening, that it's hard to draw a distinct line between, okay, that's that, and this is me. And so, I was just sort of struck by that. And I wonder what stood up for you.
Well, I like that. She had this line saying, she said, purity is a myth. And she said, we live in contaminated rubble ecologies. That was a great line. She should throw some great stuff out there like that. Like, I like it. I'm not even sure I know what it means, but I like what it sounds like. And I think when we say that idea of purity is a myth, because where it landed for me when she brought it home to herself, saying that, she'd been struggling with this illness, and, the solution was to purify her body and purify her diet. And she had taken it to the extreme, and it wasn't yielding the results that she was looking for. And I think that where human beings get lost in this notion of purity is when we disconnect it from naturalness. Like, nature is pure.
Is in you're making that assumption, or you're saying?
Well, you go into you go into the forest and the purity of the air, and you taste the water. But how is that water purified? Because it passes through many different life forms, and it's filtered by all these things that, taken separately, brought into a laboratory, it's now dirty. But from nature's standpoint, the interconnection of all these, rubble ecologies work together to create this feeling of purity. Right? And so I think when we think of what's pure is what's natural. And that's something that we can relate to, right? And nature, when we go out into the natural world, it doesn't offer us skepticism. It just reflects something really beautiful back to us. And that's why we like to be in the world. It sort of shows us who we are and how our mind works, when it's not caught up in all the contamination of the thought world and the material world, right? So in that sense, I think where purity can be a myth is when we think that it's something that we can isolate and extract and put into a test tube and think that that's what purity is. Like we might create pure oxygen, right? But pure oxygen can, burn you. So that's sort of what I was sort of reflecting on.
That's interesting, because what comes to me now too from the conversation, I think she might have used the word querying again, right, as a verb, but this sense that this idea that there's nature out there, right, is sort of up for strong consideration, as we ourselves are quote nature, in the sense of we are shifting, bacteria and beings. And so this whole idea that projecting a purity outside of us onto a nature, right, that we go to, that's sort of becoming a little more, again, one of the modern spells of the West, as opposed to that there isn't a separation. Now there is, in the sense that, again, I struggle to even find the right words of the purity of nature, because nature itself can be also toxic, in the sense toxic to humans, and yet it's still nature being itself. Just as the case is made, I think, by those more now that can say, well, technology as well, it's still part of nature. It's not outside of nature, but it does sort of shift molecules and metals to become less able to reabsorb back into nature, right? And that's, I guess, where we get the sense of toxicity and garbage dumps and all these things that are sort of the detritus that won't return, or maybe if they do, it will be quite a long time. So we've interrupted that infinite game flow and exchange. And again, I go back to the sense from a human-centric narrative, one's own ending, right? And the fear that comes up about that, and the fear of sort of constructing some sense of safety, right, from the world, which is, I think, what a lot of the conversations have touched on. This idea of, how do we, or like, how does at least the society create or cast a spell of safety as safe being possible, right? And like Steve said, I think earlier in the conversation, the news flash is that there is none. Not in the sense of that maybe, that the culture wants to sort of spellcast that there is.
Yeah, perhaps, and I really like that line in the ultimate sense. Yes, we have to be comfortable with the reality that life is uncertain. And but I'm in Costa Rica now, and there's some pretty vicious ants out here, and other kind of insects, and you're like, it's really nice for your space to not have to be invaded by the wild, where they come in, and that can be quite painful. And right, in order to do that, you got to keep your garden in a certain way, or make sure that you clean the surfaces, or it's, there's this recognition with human beings that we can only have so much proximity with the wild or with nature, because it can pose, threat or danger to us. And that's a reality, right? I watched this documentary in Utopia. I don't know if I mentioned it on the call. I think I did with Sophie. But it was really fascinating to see, this one man. He'd lost 7 or 10 children in the last 10 years, right? Because of lack of access to certain medicines, right? And certain things. Now, he lived a beautiful life in many ways, and purity, but you could see the impact on their body and on their health of things that were a result of their exposure to the wild, where we have found ways to be able to augment and prolong it. So there's this balance in between. You can't just throw the whole thing out, right? Because if I was to throw you and Castaway into the jungle, you'd be like, whoa, get me back to where I'm not in the wild, right? Because it's hard to handle it. So how do we find that I think that balance, that middle ground, and that's the sanity that we need to speak of. And I think what happens is we get caught in the extremes because we haven't lived it somehow.
Well, maybe this too will wind out our conversation too for today, because it's a beautiful segue, I think, into our next guest, which is the author Tyson Yunkaporta, who wrote the incredible book Sand Talk, subtitled "How Indigenous Wisdom Can Save the World," which is a lofty proclamation, and I suspect maybe his author, convinced him to.
I think the publishers convinced him to put that line on there, because you read the book, you're like, that's not really what he's saying.
Yeah. Although, and again, but it's an incredible window into, in this case, an Australian Indigenous way of proceeding, right, into deep, just ways of knowing, or epistemologies that are very accessible, and that he himself, I've interviewed him as well for the Mythic Masculine in the past, and he was very willing to yarn about these things. And so I just say that as a segue too, because again, I really return to this sense of what is the function of culture in this regard, because that to me is so much of the context, that if a culture is in contact with, for the purposes of this moment, let's say nature, if it's in contact with nature, it's in contact with the land, then it's like certain kinds of ways of reciprocity, of listening, of lovership is possible then, or from a culture that is not in contact, that is constantly seeking comfort and safety, and control, right? That this is something else. So that, he speaks to, I think in the book, that, and that Charles spoke to, and many others, that the sort of foundation of civilization is to seek ever more control, because there's this underlying current of fear against the chaotic instability of, quote, nature.
Yes, and in relation to the pandemic, it's important, I think, to recognize that, the majority of the voices clamoring for that safety and certainty are living in urban centers. Okay, and that's where the highest rate of transmission is, the highest rate of death is, the most overload of hospitals are these large metropolitan urban centers that have protected themselves not only from nature, but live lives very disconnected from the natural cycles and the lateral world. You can live in a lot of these urban centers and really not have any interconnection with animal or plant life, barely at all, for years on end. And so, you find these places where the microbiome or the gut biome has been depleted by up to 30%, where the stresses of modern life has depleted the immune system. So this stark disconnection from the natural world makes people more vulnerable to quote unquote wild, and more clamoring to find the solutions that are going to protect us, which feeds perfectly into this narrative of domination, of control, of measurement that we've been speaking out throughout this series. So I think we have to look at, the whole thing in context and say, what would the middle way be? If the people at the extreme end of the spectrum are the ones that are actually governing and dominating our approach, our actions, and the narrative, well, of course, it's going to feel like an imbalanced response, which is what we're experiencing today. So we got to find that way to return to the center and have compassion, knowing where they're coming from. I would be shit scared too, potentially.
Well, this maybe last thing too is that, I think Sophie used this word polyphony, right? A polyphony of voices, let's say, or perspectives, is part of a diverse ecosystem. And maybe this also touches upon what Elizabeth Sartoris said in our second conversation, right? This idea of an ecosystem of responses was sort of what a mature species would do, in this case to the pandemic, that it's not a monocultured response, which is what it seemed to be.
You'd have cures and vaccines and working on natural immune system, and you'd have sort of a robust response.
Yeah. So it does beg the question too of like, well, why this, sort of death grip on a monocultured response? And then of course, then we get into other conversations, which probably when we speak to Kelly Brogan, we'll talk at length about. So I'd love to just wind down our recap today. Thanks again to everybody watching now live and who will watch this after. Yeah, I really appreciated the time, Zamir. And for those who want to listen to the whole conversation with Sophie, the link is in the comment. below. And please be sure to join us later this week with author Tyson Yunkaporta for our next conversation.
Yeah.
Okay. Ciao.